Ladies and gentlemen, dear viewers, my name is Danylo Lubkivsky, and I'm glad to welcome you on behalf of the Kyiv Security Forum. The previous week saw two important events that I believe deserve special attention of our audience. On June 8th, the co-chairs of the US Congressional Ukraine Caucus, including Representative Marcy, Kaptur, Andy Harris, and others, sent a letter to the United States Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, calling to apply sanctions on Russian entities should they seek to complete the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. On June 12th, the North Atlantic Council recognized Ukraine as an enhanced opportunities partner, and this is another very important event that is related to our nation. This status is part of NATO's Partnership Interoperability Initiative. It aims to deepen cooperation between allies and partners, and especially those partners who aspire NATO membership. So what we see, more sanctions for the aggressor, more opportunities for Ukraine. These are two messages that Ukraine received recently from our Western partners, amid other news, and many of those news are of great concern for us as well. Can the West be united again? This is the question we are going to discuss today in our online event of the Kyiv Security Forum, and I'm delighted to present our really distinguished guests. First of all, I would like to introduce Congresswoman Marcy Kaptur, a prominent American politician, the United States representative for Ohio District. She is a member of the United States Democratic Party and currently the longest serving woman in the US Congress. Marcy Kaptur is a co-chair of the US Congressional Ukraine Caucus. I do thank you for your participation, Your Excellency. Dr. Michael Carpenter, and the managing director of the Penn Biden Center for Diplomacy and Global Engagement, the former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense and the Foreign Policy Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden. I thank you, Mike, for joining us. His Excellency Ambassador Alexander Vershbow, an American diplomat, famous American diplomat, awarded with the US State Department Distinguished Service Award, the former US Ambassador to Russia and NATO, and the former NATO Deputy Secretary General. And Arseniy Yatsenyuk, the chairman of the Kyiv Security Forum, and the former Prime Minister of Ukraine. I thank you very much for being with us and for participating in our event. And I immediately start from the questions. And my first question goes to Madam Congresswoman. Your Excellency, first of all, on behalf of the Kyiv Security Forum, let me thank you very much for your great input into US-Ukraine relations and for your personal support of Ukraine. Many Ukrainian diplomats, politicians, experts are aware of your contribution into the bipartisan efforts to support Ukraine, to help Ukraine's reforms and our fight against Russia's aggression. And I'm honored to present you to Ukraine's audience. You are Ukraine's true and committed friend, and we thank you for this. In the letter to the US Secretary of State, the members of the bipartisan Congressional Ukraine Caucus expressed concern that Russia may try to complete Nord Stream 2 pipeline. You find that the Kremlin is hoping that by fast-tracking the completion of the project, the United States will fail to respond in due speed. You said this in your appeal. Madam Congresswoman, your letter is a clear manifestation that Ukraine continues to enjoy the unwavering bipartisan support in the US Congress. Would you be so kind to tell our viewers more? How do you read the latest developments related to the ongoing Russia's offensive against the West and Ukraine? And what do you think, what should be done more by the Western authorities to deter the aggressor? And by the way, have you received any kind of feedback to your appeal? The floor is yours.
Thank you so very much, Minister Lubkivsky, and for your leadership and for this extremely distinguished panel. I'm just very honored to be a voice from the House of Representatives on behalf of our bipartisan 49-member Ukraine caucus. It grows every year. I think we're going to get our 50th member who was just elected from the state of Maryland. So I want to assure you and your listeners that you have the very strong support of the people of the United States is reflected in their elected representatives. And I want to thank the Kyiv Security Forum for organizing this very important conversation. I think I know almost everyone on the panel, having worked with you in one way or another. And I have to say to Mike Carpenter, I finally remember my own trip in 2014 with then Vice President Biden and you to attend President Poroshenko's inauguration. And it's good to see you again, Mike. And I will never forget the memory, and I'll share this with your audience, of walking down the streets in Kyiv, going to the ceremony, and the people, when they saw us turn the corner, Senator McCain was with us, the vice president, and they began to applaud. And it was a resounding applause. It was extraordinary. I'll never forget that moment. And we continue to pursue liberty for the people of Ukraine and all of Europe. And you're a part of this great historic struggle. So I thank you for all it has taken, the years of your own lives that you've dedicated to this cause. I truly view Ukraine as a scrimmage line for liberty in Europe. And we are about this task. And I hope we see it in our generation. I can definitely tell you, when I looked in the eyes of the young people of Ukraine on that particular trip, comparing it to my first trip to Ukraine in 1973 when it was Soviet occupied, I saw hope. And that was, you can't take that away. And so though it seems like a very protracted struggle, it is one that is worth fighting diplomatically and by every means that we have. So I have to say, despite the war, Ukraine is making critical strides to strengthen democratic institutions. In this conversation we're all having today, that others will hear, would have been impossible in the time when I first traveled to Ukraine. So the gift of years has let me see change. It's been glacial and slow, but it's changed for the better. Just this past week, I was thrilled to see that NATO welcomed Ukraine into the prestigious Enhanced Opportunities Partnership Program. And this will allow Ukraine to boost its interoperability, intelligence sharing, military exercise cooperation, and high-level diplomatic engagement with NATO. And truly every step forward, including this one, is critical. And we hope someday to see Ukraine as a full member of the important security umbrella of NATO. Now, in terms of the Ukraine Caucus letter, we obviously very much want to help to assure Ukraine's energy independence forward, and as well as the entire European continent. And Ukraine and our actions can really help in that regard. And so the efforts that we are making in our own legislation, our recent Defense Security Act that we passed in the House, protects Europe's energy security, and it provided for targeted sanctions on the laying of pipelines by Ukraine's neighbor to the north. And we are very interested, I think, as a country. America's had its own struggle in being energy independent. We understand what energy dependency does politically inside a country. And so the letter that we sent to the State Department urges them to apply sanctions on the pipeline should the Russians move forward. And Senator Shaheen in the Senate and Senator Cruz introduced, and I'll read you the title of the act, the Protecting Energy Security Clarification Act, which would expand the sanctions to pipeline ship insurers and certifiers. And we are working with my colleague on the other side of the aisle, Adam Kinzinger, to get this bill introduced in the House.
I do thank you. I do thank you, and I appreciate the efforts of the U.S. Congressional Ukraine Caucus. And my next question is addressed to Prime Minister Yatsenyuk. Mr. Prime Minister, don't you find that the appeal of the U.S. Congressional Ukraine Caucus deserves to be warmly praised by the Ukrainian authorities, our official authorities? The formula of our success, as I understand it, our common success, concludes two major things: the pressure from the West on the aggressor and Ukraine's real actions and steps to ensure its efficient political, economic, energy independence. So, Mr. Prime Minister, how do you see it?
We commend the efforts of the House of Representatives and personally your efforts and actions, Madam Congresswoman, in order to support the energy security in Europe. We really enjoy the bipartisan support. And in these uncharted waters, I want to be very clear that Ukraine and the United States are strategic partners. There has to be no daylight between Ukraine and the United States. Russia wants to undermine our strong bilateral relations. And we are completely sure that it's only in the interest of Russia to have tension between Ukraine and US. And we will never make this happen. In terms of Nord Stream 2, as Madam Congresswoman already mentioned, we strongly believe that Nord Stream 2 has nothing to do with the energy independence of Europe. And this is not the business project. Russia has two aims. Russia targets the European gas market, and the idea of the Russian Federation is to invade and completely control the market of the European Union and to create a bottleneck due to the construction of the Nord Stream 2. And another issue which Russia is very keen about is to bypass Ukraine and actually to eliminate Ukrainian gas transmission system. And not only Ukrainian, the same goes with Poles, with Poland, and the same goes with Slovakia. So Russian idea is to conquer the European market. Russian idea is to undermine relations between the United States and the European Union. And Russian idea is not to, has nothing to do with the business, only with the geopolitical issues. So we commend the decision of the United States to impose sanctions on Nord Stream 2. Due to this decision, we managed to sign a gas transit deal, which is far from being best, but we managed to sign this gas transit deal with the Russian Federation. In current circumstances, it's important for Europe to realize that it is in the interest of the European Union to stop this geopolitical project. And we heavily rely on the efforts of the United States to imply sanctions on those who have any kind of relations of the construction of this anti-European, anti-Ukrainian, anti-energy independent, and anti-American project, which is Nord Stream 2.
I thank you. And now I will ask our good friend, Mike Carpenter. We applaud the bipartisan initiative of the Congressional Ukraine Caucus. Mike, as the former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State and Foreign Policy Advisor to Vice President Joe Biden, you personally did a lot to support Ukraine in the most difficult times of our history. Vice President Biden was a champion of the international efforts to protect the independence of Ukraine. His mission was a success because, in my opinion, he managed to ensure the unity of both Democrats and Republicans on Ukraine. In your opinion, what should be done now to secure this united stance? The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Danylo. And, you know, Ukraine and the United States do have a strategic partnership. And a strategic partnership, unlike a tactical alignment of interests, is fundamentally based on shared values. And we share a value in striving for democracy. We share the value of respect for individual dignity and liberty. And we both share the value of fighting corruption and trying to instill rule of law. And while neither of our nations is perfect on any of those measures, those are the foundation for our strategic partnership. And I do believe that, as Congresswoman Kaptur has just elaborated, there is very strong bipartisan support in the US Congress based precisely on those values. I mean, those things that we see Ukrainians striving for, that we saw represented in the Revolution of Dignity, remind us of our own sort of best angels and interests dating back to the American Revolution. Those are the values that we share. But let's also be honest. There is a group of people inside Ukraine who desire a revanche. They desire a return to the ways of the Yanukovych regime. And their interests, frankly, whether they are politicians or whether they are oligarchs, are aligned with the Kremlin. Some of them even make pilgrimages to Moscow to seek favor from the Kremlin and from President Putin. And we also, let's be honest, we also have a group of people in the United States, some very powerful people affiliated with the White House, who would like to use Ukraine instrumentally as a tool of partisan warfare. And they are willing to disregard rule of law, and they are willing to disregard their own personal integrity to achieve their aims. We saw this very clearly in the impeachment proceedings. Now, it is my belief that those groups are small minorities in both countries. And the vast majority of the members of Congress, and in fact, the vast majority of Americans, support an independent, sovereign, democratic Ukraine ruled by law, just as they want those same things in the United States. So our goal to deepen the strategic partnership is to prevent these spoilers, both in Ukraine and in the United States, from trying to subvert the essence of our strategic partnership, and to cooperate instead precisely on those shared interests, like supporting Ukraine's energy security, like preventing the realization of Nord Stream 2, like advancing Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic integration, like promoting reforms that will instill and codify rule of law in Ukraine. That's our shared agenda, and it's one that is embraced by many Democratic congressmen, but also, and I personally know this from talking to them, many Republican congressmen and congresswomen as well. So if we remain united, if we don't allow these spoiler groups to try to undermine this relationship, I think in the long run, we're on very sound strategic footing.
Thank you for this important message. If I may, to add an important element to the list of the principles and values that Mike described, I would immediately say about the defense cooperation and our common efforts to deter Russia's aggression and offensive. On June 11, the Pentagon announced its plans for $250 million US to strengthen Ukraine's capacity to more effectively defend itself against Russian aggression. Media reports that it was pushed by Trump administration and approved by the Congress the previous week. I would like to ask Ambassador Vershbow, does this step mean that the United States in practice remains standing strongly for Ukraine despite any kind of shady, murky campaigns and developments? The floor is yours, sir.
Well, thank you very much, Danylo, and it's a pleasure to participate in this important panel discussion. Representative Kaptur and Mike have both emphasized the strong bipartisan support that exists in the United States, at least in the US Congress, for Ukraine. And I think the Pentagon's announcement last week was a welcome reaffirmation of the administration's support for Ukraine's capacity to defend itself against Russian aggression. That aggression, of course, continues unabated on the ground in eastern Ukraine, in the Black Sea and its adjoining waters, and through Russia's brutal, illegal occupation of Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula. Just in the last few days, Russian-led forces fired artillery, mortars, and anti-tank weapons at Ukrainian positions along the line of contact in the Donbass, wounding several Ukrainian soldiers. And as Ukrainians know better than I, over 10,000 of their countrymen and women have been killed in the past 6 years, despite the Russian commitment to a ceasefire in the 2014 Minsk agreements. Ceasefire it has never honored for more than a day. Although Moscow tries to shift the blame to the Ukrainian side and even pretends that its forces aren't present in the Donbass, Putin clearly believes that a prolonged war of attrition will eventually bring Ukrainians to their knees. He clearly believes that sooner or later he can force President Zelensky to accept terms for peace that would resubordinate Kyiv to Moscow, ending the Ukrainian people's hopes for a European future. So US security assistance is essential to help Ukraine defend its freedom and deter further Russian aggression. Together with tighter economic sanctions, security assistance can raise the costs to Moscow of any new offensives, show Putin that time is not on Russia's side, and lay the basis for a fair deal that restores Ukrainian sovereignty. Now, let me add that supporting Ukraine's ability to defend itself isn't just important to the survival of Ukraine as an independent democratic state. It's also important to US and allied security as well. The future of an international order based on respect for state sovereignty and the rule of law, rather than the law of the jungle, is what's at stake. Now, the types of assistance mentioned in the Pentagon's announcement addressed many of Ukraine's most critical needs: air and maritime surveillance, mobile counter-artillery radars, command and control, secure communications, cyber defense, strategic communications to counter disinformation. I'd highlight as especially important the provision by the United States of small but agile Mark 6 patrol boats that can help Ukraine safeguard freedom of navigation for its commercial ships sailing to Odessa and to Ukrainian ports along the Sea of Azov. The Pentagon also plans to provide additional funds for expanded training and exercises with US and other NATO forces, and this will help bring Ukrainian forces into closer alignment with NATO standards, which is an important requirement for Ukraine's eventual NATO membership. Now, last week's announcement was especially welcome, coming to your political question. The announcement was especially welcome after the political controversies last year that led to President Trump's impeachment. It's important that the Pentagon explicitly certified that Ukraine has made continued progress on defense and anti-corruption reforms. That's a clear refutation of the false narrative that the White House put forward last year when it suspended assistance in order to pressure President Zelensky and his government to dig up dirt on the Bidens. As Representative Kaptur said, security assistance enjoys strong bipartisan support in the Congress and should not be manipulated for partisan political purposes in the United States or in Ukraine, for that matter. Now, whether the president's re-election campaign or Russian propaganda will respect that principle remains to be seen. But I would say that whatever happens in the United States, Ukrainian political leaders and politicians should do everything that they can to avoid being drawn into US election year politics. I heard a good expression when I was last in Kyiv that politicians in Ukraine should walk between the raindrops and keep their heads down and stay as clear as they can of US domestic politics.
Thank you, Excellency. Thank you for your remarks. And now, as we turn to the second part of our discussion, my question goes and is addressed to Madam Congresswoman. Madam Congresswoman, in your appeal, you mentioned one very important initiative which unites our Western neighbors and is led by our Polish and Croatian partners and others. In your appeal, you mentioned the pledged $1 billion investment in the 3 Cs initiative fund, which might be, I quote, an important step to diversify Central and Eastern Europe energy sources and increase infrastructure resiliency among current member nations in the face of increased Russian and Chinese, you add, influence. Don't you find, Madam Congresswoman, don't you find that such an effort should also incorporate Ukraine. What should be done to get Ukraine more involved in this kind of political and investment processes in Central and Eastern Europe? The floor is yours.
Well, again, going back to the objective of energy security, I have a deep concern about Europe's energy security and trying to do everything we can to help Europe to adapt new technologies and new energy opportunities. We as a globe, maybe after 2050, maybe 2060, 2070, I can't say exactly when, but we know that natural gas supplies are going to diminish globally. And we have to bring on new technology. I think in one of the areas where Ukraine could be extraordinarily helpful to the whole world community. I've been so impressed with the people from Ukraine that I've met in the high sciences, and working on small-scale nuclear, working on all kinds of new types of solar, geothermal, wind, battery technologies, storage technologies. I walk through the fields of Ukraine and I look across these fields, and we are just at the beginning of the carbohydrate age. The 20th century was about the carbon age. We unwound the carbon molecule. In this century, we are going to unwind the carbohydrate molecule, but we have to do it more efficiently. We have to get the most BTUs out of an acre or a hectare as more than we put in. And we haven't figured that out yet through the plant sciences, but we will. And so if you look at the various layers of our energy future, including conservation, we are building homes now in our country that we call net zero because of the materials and the manner in which they are built. We are conserving an enormous amount. So we're learning. But I think in the sciences is one area for cooperation that we should really look at a high-level agreement with Ukraine, both on the industrial side. I was talking with people about Chernobyl and the ability to move solar into that region because the distribution lines still exist. You know, what would that really look like if we were to just look at solar on that site? If we look at the biofuels possibilities, if we look at natural gas discoveries, but you can't depend on those forever because once you use them up, they're gone. And so we really have to look beyond our current energy portfolio to invention. And I think that's where Ukraine really could make a huge difference. I think also in terms of military cooperation, some of our state partnership programs that currently exist with Ukraine, for instance, California. Even on the military side, we need to be much more energy conscious. And we are moving toward that in our own country. And there's a possibility for research relationships there as well. So the 3Cs initiative provides the opportunity first to put energy at the top of the priority list, and then to look at ways of forming partnerships with Ukraine to ultimately draw them into that energy union.
Thank you. Thank you. And my next question is addressed to Mike Carpenter. What we actually discuss is the matter of the unity in the West, but not only the unity, but the democratic leadership of the West. The democratic leadership of the West is the matter of Ukraine's survival, I would say. And not only because of Russia's aggression. This is because of our own ability to build a free and prosperous nation. Today, we see many worrying symptoms of persecution of political opposition in Ukraine. And I believe this undermines our security. On the other hand, we, with severe concern, many people in Ukraine follow the political and social unrest in the United States. What do you think? What are the origins of these developments? How these processes may influence the United States' global performance and the overall situation in the West with an impact upon Ukraine? The floor is yours.
Thanks, Danylo, for the question. So the way I see it, if you zoom out and look at geopolitics from a lens that really looks at all different regions of the world, what we're seeing in the 21st century is a sharpening competition between liberal democracy on the one hand and authoritarian oligarchy on the other. And if you look at countries like Russia or China or Iran or Venezuela, those are all forms of authoritarian regimes, but they're also all oligarchies. They all depend on the concentration of economic resources that are then used to concentrate political power and to undermine democratic checks and balances. And in this global struggle, the authoritarian oligarchies would like nothing more than to divide and weaken the democratic camp. For them, disunity and weakness, especially within the transatlantic community, is key to achieving their aims. They cannot engage, Russia cannot engage, for example, in energy coercion unless the West is divided. China cannot engage in technology transfers unless the West is divided. They seek to undermine the democratic camp. And we see it happening not just in terms of Russia's military actions, its war in Ukraine, which is so tragic and which has taken upwards of 13,000 lives. But we also see it, and this is very important, we also seeing it playing out in terms of the subversive measures, the active measures that Russia and frankly other countries like China and Iran are also taking to undermine our democratic systems. For our own purposes, we should remember, however, a really good quote from Pericles that I just came across the other day, which is, "It is not the strength of our enemies that we should fear most, but our own mistakes." And so I think our first principle has to be to get our own house in order, to abide by rule of law, to strengthen our democratic institutions, because that is the way that we stand united, that we engage in that strategic partnership that I spoke about earlier, and that we confront these authoritarian oligarchies. I love the line that Congresswoman Kaptur used earlier, that Ukraine is on the scrimmage line. It is exactly that. It is on the scrimmage line between liberal democracies to the west and authoritarian oligarchies to the east. And we want Ukraine to succeed, but Ukraine succeeds only when we as a transatlantic community remain united. If we don't have that unity of purpose, and if we don't redouble our own unity within our democratic societies, we won't win this scrimmage. We won't win this war or this competition.
I thank you. I hope that these messages would be heard by the Ukrainian authorities and most importantly by the Ukrainian citizens, since this is a clear understanding why should we stand together, why should we keep together. And for that, I believe that last week saw the extremely important event when the North Atlantic Council decided to recognize Ukraine as an enhanced opportunities partner. My question will be addressed to Ambassador Vershbow, to the former NATO Deputy Secretary General. This status, the enhanced opportunities partner status, tells, first of all, a lot about Ukraine's important contribution into the Euro-Atlantic security. And we clearly understand that our Euro-Atlantic security is indivisible. For that, I believe it has a huge importance and sense to strengthen and redouble our efforts aspiring for full-fledged NATO membership. And not in some far perspective, but in the near perspective that would definitely, in my opinion, promote the security of Ukraine and our NATO partners. What should be done, in your opinion, Your Excellency, to finally have the NATO doors for Ukraine open? The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Danylo. Let me first say that I very much agree with what Mike Carpenter said about the importance of strengthening our own values and our own democratic institutions. The COVID pandemic, in some ways, is a stress test for our societies. And the United States is not necessarily projecting the best example, but I think we are already beginning to see, both at the grassroots level and at the state and local level, that some of the shortcomings of our executive branch are being addressed, and that the United States still has this capacity to repair its own system, as de Tocqueville first noted 200 years ago. But on your question regarding NATO, let me say, first of all, that the decision to grant enhanced opportunities partner status was important, but it was also long overdue. Ukraine was unfairly passed over when the program was launched in 2014 as a means of deepening cooperation with NATO's most interoperable partners. At the Wales Summit that year, EOP status was extended to Georgia, Finland, Sweden, Australia, and Jordan. But the Allies were reluctant to upgrade Ukraine's status while hostilities with Russia in the Donbass were still escalating. And I regret that there was a certain timid stance for several years after that. But better late than never. I think that the enhanced opportunity partner status does recognize the progress Ukraine has made in improving the interoperability of its forces with those of the Allies, experience that was gained in the operations in Afghanistan and earlier in the Western Balkans. And it's also a recognition that Ukraine is deadly serious about its own defense, which is an important qualification for NATO membership. And with Ukraine spending close to 5% of GDP, it puts most of the Allies to shame in terms of taking care of its own defense needs. But I think that the EOP status is not just symbolic, but will also give Ukraine some additional opportunities to participate in more demanding NATO exercises, to hold confidential political discussions with NATO on strategic challenges, to share information and intelligence on current and emerging threats. In short, it's sort of an opportunity for Ukraine to demonstrate again that it has already the capability to act like a good ally. And this will eventually pave the way for Ukraine's future membership. I'd also stress that cooperation between Ukraine and NATO is definitely a two-way street. Allies have benefited significantly from the training and exercising they've done with the battle-tested Ukrainian forces, who fought the Russians to a draw in the Donbass in the face of the Russians' applications of all kinds of new technologies, from electronic warfare to drones and long-range precision strike. And Ukraine is often called the laboratory for Russian hybrid warfare. NATO commanders have often told me how much they've learned from Ukraine's experience as a target of subversion, cyber attacks, information operations. And these lessons learned will help NATO ensure that Russian little green men can't do to Baltic states what they were able to do in Crimea. So I think NATO now has to take the next step. This can't just be a plateau in Ukraine's relations with NATO. On the most immediate level, I think NATO should now move to fully integrate Ukraine in its development of a comprehensive Black Sea strategy, which is the most important piece of unfinished business on NATO's agenda. Because I think NATO needs to work more closely with Ukraine and Georgia, for that matter, to counter the Russians' military buildup, including its big buildup in occupied Crimea, and its continued interference with freedom of navigation in the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. In terms of NATO membership, EOP status isn't a replacement for NATO membership, nor does it guarantee any future outcome beyond what NATO has already said. But I think that it does provide more impetus to the kind of cooperation and greater interoperability that will build the case for Ukraine's acceptance into the ranks of alliance members in the next few years. I hope that U.S. will show greater leadership on the issue of actual integration of Ukraine as a member, and I think Congress can help in pushing this administration and the next one in that direction. Ukraine was promised membership at the Bucharest summit in 2008, and NATO has to live up to its own promises sooner or later.
Great. Thank you, Excellency, for this answer. Ambassador Vershbow says that no plateau may appear in the relations between Ukraine and the alliance. And I cannot agree more that the status of the enhanced opportunities partners is an important step but it's not a final destination for Ukraine, and nor for the alliance in the relations with our nation. It's important that the incumbent authorities in Ukraine continue what was laid down in 2014 and 19, when Prime Minister Yatsenyuk led the Ukraine's government, and the political union of the national forces here in our nation decided to choose the course on NATO membership as our strategic one. So my question goes to Prime Minister Yatsenyuk. How do you assess the dynamics and the progress we achieve in our relations with NATO, and what should be done further?
Let me give you a few reflections on very important things that honorable panelists just addressed. You know, we are all facing a really challenging time, the world and our nations. And crystal clear that the only way to have strong dictatorships is to have, on the other hand, weak democracies with the undermined values. The weaker we are, the stronger autocrats and dictators become. The best, I would say, tool, for example, for Russian President Putin to maintain his autocratic regime is to divide Europe, is to divide NATO, and is to divide strong relations between Ukraine and the United States. It's of crucial importance to have US military presence in Europe, particularly in Germany. And this is a very clear-cut sign. The stronger American presence in Europe, the higher security we have in the European continent. So, and it is in the national interest of the United States and of the complete entire world. Look what Russians are doing. They want to undermine not just relations between the United States and the European Union, the United States and Ukraine. They launched a very sophisticated fake news war against our countries. The narrative they are trying to sell is that it's not Russia who meddled into the US elections, who meddled into the elections in the entire Europe, who tried to assassinate British citizen in Salisbury, who undermines NATO. It's Ukraine. And they want to find some partners in Europe and in the United States who want to sell this narrative. It is Russia who meddled into the US elections. Another issue is that, for example, some foreign countries trying to rule Ukraine. This is complete nonsense. Last time I made a statement, and this time I want to reiterate it. Never ever any high-profile US official, neither the President of the United States, President Obama, or Vice President Biden, intervened or interfered into the Ukrainian domestic affairs. What they have done, they supported this country. They did everything in order to save Ukraine, to provide energy independence, financial independence for this country, in order to deter the Russian aggression against Ukraine. And this is the truth. And we have to fight for this truth. We have to stand our ground. Security is not just military security. Security is an energy security. And for example, we managed with the previous US administration to provide a reverse flow of the natural gas for Ukraine. And for the first time in the history of the Ukrainian country, we are not purchasing any single cubic meter of the natural gas from the Russian Gazprom. No one believed this a decade ago. It was completely impossible. We succeeded. We did it together with you, with the United States, with Europeans, and with the strong Ukrainian leadership. In terms of military security, the previous US administration supported Ukraine in making Ukrainian military more durable and stronger. We got technical support from the previous administration. We got financial support. We got the supply of non-lethal weapon. The current administration provided a lethal weapon for Ukraine, and we enjoyed the bipartisan support of the US Congress, which is of crucial importance for Ukraine. NATO is a key pillar of the security in the world. Look what's going on in the world. It's a complete mess. So we need stability, and stability is the entity or the unity, I would say, of all NATO allies. And Ukraine, the time will come when Ukraine will become the NATO member. In 2008, I was a co-signatory as a Speaker of the House to the NATO asking membership action plan for Ukraine. Now I want to reiterate my message. We are very grateful for the NATO that we have been granted an enhanced opportunities partnership program. But we strongly believe that the appeal that had been made in 2008 to grant Ukraine a membership action plan will be heard by NATO, and we will make it together. Our free world stronger, more united, and brighter.
Thank you. And I will immediately turn to Mike Carpenter, if I may. Mike, will you agree with what Prime Minister Yatsenyuk is saying in terms of stability and in terms of this security pillar, which may be a result of our common efforts, I mean NATO and Ukraine? Just before our discussion, I read in the press the reaction which comes from the Kremlin to the decision of the North Atlantic Council. And the spokesperson for President Putin, Mr. Peskov, said that no way, it will cause the instability if NATO grants Ukraine such a status. It will upset, I mean, it sounded almost like a threat, almost like a message of warning to Ukraine and the West. What would you tell to the spokesperson of President Putin for answering to his message of hate and threats? The floor is yours.
Well, I would tell him, look, I understand that you feel threatened by the fact that there are democracies on your periphery, that there are countries that can succeed in establishing rule of law and democratic institutions, and that can respect their citizens' rights. And I understand that in an authoritarian kleptocracy, those things are frightening. Those things are a threat. But make no mistake, Ukraine will be a member of the Euro-Atlantic family. It will integrate into these institutions. It is a matter of time. It is only a question of when. And so, frankly, from our perspective, what we need to focus on is preparing Ukraine for that membership, enabling the reforms, providing the equipment, the resources, the training, and so on, so that Ukraine is ready to enter on day one when it becomes a member of these institutions. And I mean specifically NATO and the EU. And so that's why enhanced opportunity partnership is important, because it is a tool for preparing Ukraine for its eventual membership in European institutions, which is where it belongs.
Thank you. That's a good answer. And Ambassador Vershbow, what we see from Kyiv's perspective, and when we follow the developments in the West, we definitely noticed what we may call political dispute between the official authorities in DC and in Germany within the Euro-Atlantic family. And this, let me, as I said, call it dispute, this kind of emotional exchange of views and ideas. And as of recently, we've heard that President Trump is going to decrease the amount of troops in Germany and so on, and other decisions of that kind. All these developments, they are used by the Russian propaganda to say that, look, the West is not as strong as it was before. What would you suggest, given your distinguished experience as the senior diplomat in the United States system, what would you suggest to the authorities in the West how to answer that question that we put as the title of our discussion, how to make the West united again? The floor is yours.
Okay. Well, first of all, the decision by President Trump, which he's now officially confirmed publicly, that he intends to punish Germany by withdrawing some U.S. forces, is a very bad signal. And I hope that there'll be strong voices from the Congress, as well as from the general public, making clear that this is a misguided decision which is going to harm U.S. security and defense, and weaken NATO's deterrent, and give, unfortunately, the kind of ammunition that you mentioned to President Putin and to Russian propagandists to tell Ukraine that the West is in disarray and you can't count on the West. You should return to the fold and accept becoming a junior partner or a new subordinate of Russia. So the West has to get its own house in order. And of course, we have elections that will decide these things in a more fundamental sense coming up very soon. But even with the withdrawal from Germany, the U.S. Overall troop presence in Europe remains very strong. And of course, there has been progress, in fact, in allies spending more on their own defense, on raising the readiness of their forces, on making NATO's deterrence of Russian aggression more credible, more agile, since the invasion of Ukraine 6 years ago. So this is an unfortunate decision, but I don't think it's by any means the end of the story. But I would just add that Ukraine can help us by continuing to demonstrate the kinds of seriousness about its own defense, about making good use of the tools that NATO has provided to improve its interoperability, to enable Ukraine to contribute to international peace and security, even as it defends itself in the Donbass, and by carrying out the broad spectrum of political, economic, and judicial reforms that ultimately are going to be just as important to Ukraine's eventual entry into NATO as its military interoperability. So, as Mike said, it's only a question of when, not whether, Ukraine will join NATO, but I think staying on the path of reform, getting over some of the zigzags that we've seen, frankly, in the last 3 or 4 months, and continuing to demonstrate that it is acting in every way like an ally, and that it deserves to have that status formalized by its admission into NATO, as was promised at the Bucharest summit.
I thank you. Madam Congresswoman, as we approach the end of our discussion, I would kindly ask you to send a concluding message to the Ukrainian audience and to our international audience, as well, as we are followed by many viewers abroad, answering the same question that I asked Ambassador Vershbow. What should be done to have the West united again? For Ukraine, this is the matter of the highest strategic importance. The floor is yours.
Yes, I think it's really important for Ukraine and her allies around the world to recognize we are living in a period of a generational shift. In other words, those who remember World War II, who remember the 20th century, and the vast loss of life on the European continent, the younger generation, at least in our country, didn't experience that. Some of them know the history of their families and some of them don't. I have to say to Minister Yatsenyuk, I've traveled to many places in our world, and when I first saw the war memorial along the Dnieper River in your country, I was transfixed. I don't think I have ever seen a war memorial that spoke to the sacrifice that that memorial represents. We have beautiful memorials in our country, but I think that the celebration of conquest over tyranny is a story the younger generation has to understand. And we need to do a better job of it as leaders. And people need to understand the history of their own families. And I think we need to do a lot of work on that. In your country, many people remember through their grandparents. And so I think there's a lack of historical grounding. And whether one lives on the European continent or here in North America, I think that that historical memory is extraordinarily important. I had an experience, I was at a Ukrainian event at the Institute of Peace in Washington, and I was thinking about the women of Ukraine, because I know they're feeding your country right now. And I thought, how can we better recognize these women? These are heroic, these are current day heroes, heroines today. And they're planting in the occupied territories. I said, talk about courage with landmines and unexploded ordnance, and they're out there in the springtime. I said, how do we bring this to the attention of the world? And one of the young women that was with me, she said, you don't have to tell me anything. Here's my babusha. And she brought up this video of her babusha in the Donbass planting in her kitchen, walking through her kitchen. And she said, there's nothing the world can teach her. She can survive anything. I said, then let's make her a heroine, not just for your family, but let's find a way to do this and to show the people who are survivors and who believe that their efforts for their children and grandchildren are extraordinarily important, are so important to the world. And so I'm just saying to you, you are all powerful in your own right. The current president of Ukraine came from the film industry. And I think to myself, we need some artists now. We need people who can deal with film, who can take your words, our words here today, but to imbue them with the story of the human struggle for liberty. And there is no more important place to begin that discussion than Ukraine today. And then to remind our European partners, Ambassador, you serve there with such distinction. You know, though the younger generations there have to remember too. And as we go around and we see these memorials and we celebrate formally, but I think through social media we can do a lot more to talk about that sacrifice and the responsibility of this generation, and to give those young people that I met in the squares of Kyiv hope that their generation too, based on that sacrifice, can bring a transformational period to their own country and access to liberty and the European Union. So I think we need a few artists as well as diplomats at this point. And I know you all have the power to help make that happen. And we need to tell those stories. And the story of the struggle for liberty that drew in the United States to be an ally during World War II and then to help rebuild Europe. And we are still there. And in terms of President Trump, to my knowledge, and I've been doing a lot of research, I can't find one veteran in his family. I don't think he really knows. He was a private businessman who made a lot of money working with the oligarch class in our country and elsewhere. And I don't really think he could possibly understand what my family and other families in this country gave in World War I and World War II in Europe. I don't think he has a sense of it. He just simply does. They just don't know. Again, it's a generation without a history. They don't understand why they were benefited by the liberty that they have enjoyed. And so I just think I've seen European and Ukrainian artistry. And I think in the field of film and social media now, we could really do Europe a favor by producing that kind of memory. So thank you for letting me offer that opinion. And then to say that in terms of energy, I just wanted to end with one statement, and that is proceeding forward with small steps. I think an interconnect between Poland and Ukraine through the 3 Cs initiative makes sense. I think also possibly a grid connection with Hungary as initial steps. And don't forget what I said about energy partnerships, including in research. I think Ukraine could move forward on that, both domestic, both in the civilian sector as well as the military. And I think I'm just so proud of you and for what you are doing and the message that you are sending out. Thank you for having me on this panel on behalf of my Ukrainian caucus, Congressman Fitzpatrick of Philadelphia, Congressman Mike Quigley of Illinois, Congressman Andy Harris of Maryland. We have many, many supporters on both sides of the aisle.
Right, right. I do appreciate it. And Madam Congresswoman, let me, on behalf of our small but strong team of the Kyiv Security Forum, let me thank you warmly, and please pass our gratitude to all the 49 and I hope 50 members of the US Congressional Ukraine Caucus for everything you do to support Ukraine, to support our bilateral strategic partnership. And here I invite for a very brief message for Mr. Arseniy Yatsenyuk to conclude what have been discussed today. You're welcome.
Well, just going back to the statement issued by Kremlin, that Kremlin is concerned about the security of Europe due to the fact that NATO granted status of additional or extensive opportunities. Well, if Russia says no, it means that we have made the right decision. I know who contributes into insecurity. It's Russia. So the stronger we are, the more we are united, the better this world will be.
Wonderful. And with this, let me thank you all. Let me thank all our distinguished, prominent participants for such a great, splendid conversation and exchange. We do appreciate it. And the mission of the Kyiv Security Forum continues, and we move on. And I do thank you. I thank you for this wonderful discussion. Thank you. Дякую.
Дякую.
Thank you, everyone. It was awesome, amazing. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, we do appreciate.
Take care.